My name is Claire Dempsey. I am 38 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the same zip code where I grew up, which my sister Vanessa has never once let me forget. I'm a fifth-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary. I drive a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield I keep meaning to fix. I grade papers at the kitchen table every night with a glass of red wine and NPR on low, and most evenings I'm in bed before 10 because 23 kids will need me emotionally present by 7:45 the next morning. My apartment is small. My savings account is modest. My name has never appeared in a newspaper except once, when my class won a regional reading contest and the photo ran in the Columbus Dispatch, so blurry you could barely make out my face. This is what my sister pointed to when she told 40 people at my father's funeral that I had always been the disappointment. And this is the story of what she didn't know. My father, Gerald Dempsey, died on a Thursday in late October. Heart attack. He was 67, which felt both shocking and somehow expected, the way some deaths do when you've spent years quietly worrying and never saying it out loud. He was a gentleman who liked crossword puzzles and bad puns, and the particular way Ohio looks in October when the maples turn. He coached my little league team when I was 9, even though neither of us was any good at baseball. He drove 4 hours in a snowstorm once to bring me soup when I had the flu my second year of teaching, and he didn't tell anyone he'd done it. That was the kind of man he was. The funeral was held at St. Anthony's, the church we grew up attending every Sunday until we were old enough to make excuses. The pews were nearly full. Dad had been in the same neighborhood for 30 years. People loved him in the quiet way people love someone who never makes anything about himself. Vanessa stood near the entrance, greeting people like it was a cocktail party she'd organized. I should tell you about Vanessa, because you need to understand what she looks like from the outside before you understand what she looked like from the inside. She's 3 years younger than me and has been considered the successful one since approximately our junior year of high school, when she started interning at our father's small regional logistics company, Dempsey Supply Partners. By 30, she was running operations. By 35, she had rebranded it, brought in 2 new clients, and moved into a 4-bedroom house in Dublin, the expensive suburb west of the city, with a kitchen that had been photographed for a home design blog. She drove a silver Audi that she replaced every 3 years. She took vacations to places I'd only seen on Instagram. She wore clothes that looked intentional in a way mine never did. At every family gathering for the past decade, somebody asked Vanessa about the company and then turned to ask me how teaching was going, with the energy of someone asking about a minor hobby. I had learned to answer in 2 sentences and redirect. I want to be honest with you. For most of my adult life, I thought Vanessa deserved it. I thought she had worked harder. I thought the difference between us was simply ambition, that she wanted more and went and got it while I chose the slower, quieter path. It took me a long time to understand that choosing a quieter path doesn't make you less. It only makes you less visible, and invisible people become easy to dismiss. At the reception after the funeral, I was standing near the coffee table talking to my father's old friend Roy, who had worked with him for 20-some years, when I heard Vanessa's voice carry across the room with the particular clarity of someone who doesn't realize, or doesn't care, how far sound travels. Her cousin Brenda had asked how she was holding up, managing the company, all of it. Vanessa said, honestly, she'd been managing it for years, because Dad spent half his time trying to help Claire find her footing, and the other half worrying about her, and she had basically been running things solo for longer than anyone realized. Brenda made a sympathetic sound, and Vanessa said, some people just never quite figure out what they're built for. We all knew teaching wasn't going to set the world on fire, but Dad never stopped hoping she'd find something else. It was sweet, but it was a distraction. The room didn't go silent. That's not how these moments work. The conversation kept moving around me. People kept holding their paper plates. But the 4 or 5 people closest to us had heard it. And I knew they heard it because I saw the careful way they looked away. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't some clean, cinematic anger. It was something messier. It was the feeling of being 17 years old again at the dinner table when Dad praised Vanessa's internship application while my report card sat unopened on the counter. It was the particular sting of hearing something said out loud that you'd suspected someone believed for years. It was humiliation, yes, but underneath the humiliation was something colder, grief, because my father was dead. and I would never get to ask him if it was true. If you've ever had someone summarize your entire life as a footnote to someone else's story, you know exactly what that feels like. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to know. I didn't confront Vanessa that day. It wasn't weakness. I've thought about it many times since, and I still believe it was the right call. What would I have said, standing in the church hall with my father's friends watching, my eyes already raw from crying? It would have looked like a scene. It would have looked like exactly what she'd described, the sister who couldn't hold it together. Instead, I drove home. I sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for a while. I called my closest friend Priya, who teaches 3rd grade down the hall from me and has known me for 11 years, and I told her what happened. Priya said several things I won't repeat here because they weren't appropriate for a church crowd. Then she said, "You know what you should do?" "Nothing. Not yet." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Just wait." People like Vanessa always leave a thread hanging. I had no idea at that point how right she was going to be. 7 days after the funeral, I received a phone call from a man named Howard Kessler. He introduced himself as my father's estate attorney, which surprised me because I hadn't known my father had one. He asked if I could come to his office. I said yes. He said, "Bring a photo ID and plan to stay for about an hour." I went on a Tuesday after school. His office was in a low brick building near downtown, the kind of place with waiting room chairs from 1994, and a receptionist who offered me coffee that I accepted and then didn't drink because my stomach was doing something complicated. Howard was a slight man in his late 60s with reading glasses he kept removing and replacing throughout the conversation. He said he'd been my father's attorney for 19 years. He said my father was a thorough man. Then he set a wooden box on the desk between us. It was about the size of a shoebox, dark walnut, with a small brass clasp. My name was written on the top in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. He printed his lowercase letters in a particular way, slightly oversized, like he was worried someone might misread them. Inside the box were 12 envelopes, each one numbered in the upper right corner, 1 through 12 in the same handwriting. Howard said I could open them here or at home. He said there were also several documents he would walk me through after I'd had a chance to read the letters. He slid a folder across the desk. He said, "Take your time." I opened envelope number 1. The first letter was dated 3 years ago. It started the way you'd expect a letter from your father to start, just talking. Talking about a morning he'd had, a particular sunrise over the backyard, a thing my mother used to say about October that he still thought about. Then it shifted. He said he'd been meaning to write this for a while. He said he'd been noticing things he didn't know what to do with yet, and writing was how he'd always processed what he didn't know how to say out loud. I read all 12 letters that afternoon, sitting in Howard's office while he quietly answered emails on his computer and refilled my coffee once without asking. The first 3 letters were just memories, stories about me and Vanessa growing up, small things I'd forgotten, a camping trip where I caught a fish and cried because I felt bad for it and made him throw it back, the way I used to leave library books in every room of the house, the time I stayed up all night before a science fair project and then left it on the bus and still somehow placed second with a backup poster I made in an hour, and how proud that had made him, not because I won, but because I didn't quit. He wrote about Vanessa too, with love, but with something careful underneath the love. He wrote about the way she'd taken to the company, her drive, her instincts, how he'd been grateful and proud. Then, very quietly, he wrote about the day he started noticing something that didn't add up. Letter 4 was where the tone changed. He described a meeting about 5 years ago where the company's accountant flagged a small recurring discrepancy in the operational accounts. Not large enough to raise a formal alarm, small enough that on its own, it looked like a rounding error. But his accountant had circled it with a question mark, and my father, who had built this company from almost nothing and knew its numbers the way you know, a house you've lived in for 30 years, had felt something shift in his stomach. He didn't confront Vanessa. He started watching. Over the next 2 years, he documented what he found. The letters were his record. He wrote dates, amounts, transaction descriptions, discrepancies between what the accounts showed and what the corresponding receipts confirmed. He wasn't an investigator. He was a 60-something man who trusted spreadsheets and kept carbon copies of everything, because he'd been burned by paperwork mistakes twice in the 80s and never forgot it. The amounts weren't dramatic individually. $300 here, $1,200 there, a vendor payment that was slightly inflated, a consulting fee for a firm that, when he looked it up, didn't appear to have a website or a registered address. They were the kind of irregularities that a casual observer would dismiss and that an attentive owner would follow quietly, hoping to find an innocent explanation. There wasn't one. Letter 7 hit me like something physical. My father had calculated the total. Over 7 years, starting shortly after Vanessa took over day-to-day operations, the discrepancies added up to somewhere between $340,000 and $400,000. He hadn't been able to confirm the upper end, but he was confident in the lower estimate. He'd had it reviewed quietly by a forensic accountant friend he trusted, without naming the company or his daughter. The friend confirmed what he suspected. I had to set the letter down and look at the ceiling for a minute. The silver Audi, the Dublin house, the kitchen in the home design blog. I thought about every family dinner where Vanessa talked about growth strategy and client acquisition, while I talked about reading curriculum, and how everyone at the table treated these subjects as though they existed on different planets of importance. I thought about the funeral, about her voice carrying over the coffee table. She'd been running things solo. Dad spent all his time worrying about Claire. He'd been watching her. He'd been grieving her, too. But he hadn't been worried about me. I picked the letter back up. He wrote that he hadn't known what to do with what he'd found. Vanessa was his daughter. He loved her. He also understood, with a clarity that clearly pained him to write, that she had not changed and was not going to. He'd dropped hints. He'd restructured a few accounts with new oversight. The withdrawals had slowed, but hadn't stopped. They'd just gotten more creative. He didn't want to destroy her, but he also couldn't pretend he didn't know, so he'd made a plan. The folder Howard slid across the desk contained several things: a detailed financial summary, prepared with the forensic accountant's guidance, organized by year, copies of transaction records, invoices, and the corresponding discrepancies, highlighted in yellow, a statement from the accountant, and a memo my father had drafted for the company's board, which was small, just 3 outside members, explaining his concerns and the documentation behind them. He hadn't sent the memo. He'd left that decision to me. Letter 12 explained why. He wrote, "Claire, I'm leaving this to you because you are the person in this family I trust most not to abuse it. Not because you're weak, because you understand that power over someone isn't the same thing as using it. You've always known the difference between what you're capable of and what you should do. I've watched you choose decency every time. Life gave you the option to choose something sharper. That's not smallness. That's character. I should have told you that more clearly while I was alive to say it. I'm sorry that I didn't. He should have told me. I'm not going to pretend that sentence didn't stay with me for days afterward, because it did. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask you something honestly. If you'd been in my position, what would you have done? Would you have gone to Vanessa immediately? Would you have called the board yourself? Or would you have waited, the way Priya suggested, and watched for the thread she mentioned? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious and I always read them. Here's what I actually did. I waited 2 weeks, not because I was afraid, because I needed to be sure of something. I needed to be sure that what I was feeling wasn't just grief or humiliation, sharpening itself into something that looked like justice. I'm a teacher. I spend all day trying to teach children the difference between reacting and responding. It seemed important that I practice what I taught. During those 2 weeks, I called Howard twice with questions. I reread the letters. I organized the financial documents into a binder, the way I organize things for school, tabs and labels, and a summary page up front. I also did something my father hadn't done. I looked up the consulting firm whose name appeared on 4 of the flagged invoices. It had been registered as an LLC in Delaware. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize, but the mailing address listed was a P.O. box in Dublin, Ohio, the same suburb where Vanessa lived. I sat with that information for a full day before I called Howard. He wasn't surprised. He said my father had suspected as much but hadn't been able to confirm it. He said it was the kind of structure someone sets up when they want distance between themselves and a transaction. He also said carefully that if the board received the documentation, they would almost certainly involve outside counsel. An outside counsel would likely involve an auditor, and an auditor would find what my father's accountant had found, and probably more. He asked how I wanted to proceed. I said, I want to give Vanessa one chance to do this herself. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's your prerogative. I called Vanessa on a Sunday morning. I asked her to meet me for coffee. She sounded slightly put out, the way she always did when I asked for something, but she said yes. We met at a diner we'd gone to with our parents growing up, which was my choice, and which felt important to me in a way I didn't fully explain to her. We sat across from each other in a booth near the window with our coffees and the particular discomfort of two sisters who have never quite known how to be in a room together as adults. I told her I'd met with Howard. I told her about the box and the letters. Her face didn't change much, but something behind her eyes moved. I said Dad documented some things about the company finances over the past few years. I said I wanted her to know that before anything else happened because she was my sister and he was our father, and I didn't think he'd want the first move to be made without giving her the chance to respond. She said, What things? I said I thought she probably knew what things. The silence between us lasted long enough that the waitress came by and topped off our coffees. Vanessa watched her leave. Then she looked back at me and said, Dad had struggled with the accounting side of things in his later years, that she'd had to step in to clean up several messes he'd created without meaning to, and that whatever he'd written needed to be understood in that context. I looked at her. She looked at me. I said, I'm going to give you a few days to think about this. And I said it without blinking, without raising my voice, without giving her any indication of whether I was bluffing or not. I'd learned that from 23 10-year-olds. Never let them see you uncertain. She called me 2 days later. She said I was confused. She said Dad had been showing signs of cognitive decline for the past couple of years, that the family had been keeping it quiet because it was private, and that the documents I was referencing needed to be evaluated in that light. She said she would be happy to sit down with the board to clear everything up, and that she hoped we could handle this as a family without lawyers getting further involved. I thanked her for calling and said I'd be in touch. Then I called Howard and told him to send the memo. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 3.5 weeks after the funeral. It was held at the company's office in a conference room I'd been in twice in my life. I was not a board member. I had no official role. But Howard had informed the board that my father had left me the documentation as executor of his wishes regarding this specific matter, and they had agreed to my presence. Vanessa arrived looking exactly as she always did, polished, composed. She'd clearly been told the general subject of the meeting, but not the full scope of what Howard was bringing. I watched her read the room when she walked in and do the calculation that people like her do, figuring out who was on her side, who was neutral, who could be managed. She didn't look at me for the first several minutes. Howard presented the summary, then the transaction records, then the statement from the forensic accountant, then the Delaware LLC registration with its Dublin mailing address. The board was quiet in that particular way that rooms get quiet when the air has gone somewhere. Vanessa said the records were being misinterpreted. She said the consulting arrangement had been a legitimate operational expense that she had disclosed verbally to her father. She said she was prepared to provide documentation. One of the board members, a man named Frank, who I knew had worked with my father for almost 15 years, looked at her very carefully and asked when, specifically, she had disclosed this arrangement. She said approximately 4 years ago. Frank said the LLC had been registered 3 years ago. The room got quiet again. Howard set the final document on the table. It was letter 12. He read the relevant passage aloud. My father's voice in that room, in that particular handwriting read aloud by a near stranger, was one of the stranger experiences of my life. I kept my hands flat on the table and breathed steadily, the way I tell my students to breathe when they're overwhelmed. Vanessa looked at me for the first time. I didn't look away. I want to tell you something about that moment, because I've thought about it a lot. I wasn't feeling what I expected to feel. There was no triumph. There was no satisfaction of the sharp, satisfying kind you imagine in situations like this. There was mostly grief for my father, for what she'd taken from him without him being able to say so directly while he was alive. for the sister I'd wanted her to be, for the years I'd spent measuring myself against her without knowing the full picture. But underneath all of that, quiet and solid as a floor, was something I'd never felt quite as clearly before. My father had trusted me, not with money, not with power, with this. He'd believed I would handle it correctly, and I think I had. Vanessa left the meeting before it formally concluded. I heard later from Howard that she'd retained her own attorney by the following morning. The company brought in an outside auditor. The final number, after 4 months of review, was $387,000. The board filed a civil complaint. Vanessa's attorney negotiated a repayment arrangement. She sold the Dublin house. The Audi came after. She called me once about 6 weeks into the process and said I had destroyed her. I said, you made financial decisions for 7 years that you knew were wrong. I gave you the chance to address them yourself. She hadn't taken it. She said she couldn't believe I would do this to family. I said, I didn't do this to you, Vanessa. I just stopped covering for you. She hung up. The thing nobody tells you about a moment like this is what comes after. Not the practical after, not the legal proceedings or the audit or the board restructuring, the emotional after. Because even when someone has treated you poorly for years, even when you have every reason to feel vindicated, it still hurts to watch a family member burn down something they built themselves. Vanessa had real talent. She could have run that company honestly, and it still would have grown. The money she took wasn't necessary. That was the part I couldn't make sense of. She'd taken it because she could, because the access was there and she believed she'd earned something extra for simply showing up every day. Entitlement is a strange thing. It doesn't feel like theft to the person doing it. It feels like compensation. I went to my father's grave in March, a few months after everything had settled. It was one of those Ohio mornings that can't decide if it's still winter, cold enough for a coat, but the light had that early spring quality to it, thin and clear. I brought the last letter with me, even though I'd read it a dozen times. There's a line near the end I hadn't fully understood until that morning. He wrote, I know this is a hard thing to leave you, and I know you'll wonder why I didn't handle it myself while I still could. The honest answer is that I was afraid, not of Vanessa, of losing her. I kept thinking she might change, and I gave that possibility too many years. By the time I understood she wouldn't, I was too tired and too close to the end to do it cleanly. So I gave it to you. And I gave it to you because I knew you'd find a way to do what was right without letting it make you into something you're not. I sat by the grave for a while after reading it. The ground was damp. Someone had left flowers that were starting to turn. I thought about fifth grade, about 23 kids and 30-year-old desks, learning how to read and think and treat each other with some basic decency, about how that work doesn't photograph well and doesn't fit neatly into a conversation about growth strategy. But it matters in ways that compound quietly over years, the way small deposits do. My father knew what I was worth. He just hadn't always said it clearly enough. I drove back to Columbus. I stopped at the grocery store. I went home, graded papers, poured myself half a glass of wine, and put NPR on low. My life looks exactly the same from the outside. The cracked windshield is still there. I'm still up by 10. I'm still in the same zip code, but I carry something now that I didn't carry before. Not the letters, though I've kept them. Something quieter than that. The knowledge that someone who knew me completely, who had seen every version of me, including the versions I'm not proud of, had looked at the whole picture and decided I was the person he trusted most. That's not nothing. In fact, if you think about it, that's everything. If this story meant something to you, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your country, the time it is wherever you are right now. I read every single one. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, if you've ever been the quiet one, the steady one, the one people forget to celebrate, subscribe to this channel. Because we tell those stories here, and we tell them honestly. Every week, a new one. Every week, a woman who refused to let someone else write the last chapter. I'll see you in the next story.